Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome and happy Polish Constitution Day. During tonight's program, we invite you to leave your questions, comments, and reflections in the chat, and we'll ask some of those questions to our authors during the Q&A at the end of the conversation. Tonight, we celebrate with a very special discussion with some of Chicago's most notable creatives of the written word connected to Chicago. Now living across the United States, ForgottenChicago.com editor Daniel Pogorzelski will interview authors Stuart Dybek, Thomas Dyja, John Guzlowski, and Dominic Pacyga as they share their thoughts on who they are. Before we start, I want to give a very special thanks to the many wonderful co-sponsors from the Polish American community in Chicago who have joined us for tonight's program. Special thanks to CPL's Polish Heritage Committee, the Consulate General of the Republic of Poland in Chicago, Alliance of Polish Clubs, the organizers of the annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, the Polish Arts Club of Chicago, and Polish American Congress Illinois Division for their co-sponsorship and their support. Tonight's moderator is Daniel Pogorzelski, editor of ForgottenChicago.com. Daniel has championed tonight's program, and we want to especially acknowledge all of his work in making tonight happen. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Daniel, Stuart, Thomas, John, and Dominic to the CPL virtual stage. Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you very much for having all of us. I think this is going to be an excellent discussion tonight, and I think that along the lines of what we're exploring here today, what does it mean to be Polish? What does it mean to be American? There are plenty of gray areas. I think maybe even looking at who we have here. So among the speakers tonight, Dominic is the only credentialed historian. And yet, when you look at the authors that we have here today, each of them, their works are heavily influenced by history, which, by the way, is one of the things that I see as the dead hand of the past, something that no matter how de-ethnicized one's experience, whether it's lived or thought could be, definitely permeates all of your creativity. Also, whether you write in poetry or prose, that Slavic poetic soul comes through, whether it's in Dominic or Thomas's tellings of history, or in the lyrical poetry that you'll read and touching works that you'll have from both John Guzlowski and Stuart Dybek. And so I guess along with those blurred lines, it'd be good to establish a little bit about each one of our very accomplished speakers. And in my estimation, each of you have resumes that alone could be a program in and of itself. And so I guess, if you don't mind, I'll begin here with Stuart. By the way, when we selected the panel for tonight's speaking, since there are so many different Polish communities, and that's part of why we have this array of folks, is to show the diversity within Chicago's Polish community. We have it where, in terms of the sides of the city, we have Thomas, who grew up on the north side. We have not one, but two Southsiders. Oftentimes Southsiders of Chicago will say, oh Lord, we got shortchanged. You know, it's the Northsiders always taking everything. And so we have Stuart, who's from Pilsen, as well as Dominic, who is from the back of the yards. And then you have John Guzlowski, who grew up in Humboldt Park on the west side, and also for a bit lived in Logan Square. So without further ado, I guess I'll begin by first asking, and I'll ask Stuart here. Stuart, tell us about the neighborhood that you grew up in.
Well, it was started out by being called Pilsen. So it was a neighborhood in everybody's mind about beer. And it was a neighborhood of storytellers. We didn't have air conditioning. On a summer night, people came with their beers and sat on the front steps and talked and told stories. It was a neighborhood in which religion played a particularly strong role, so that the only thing that had more corner space than churches were bars, except we called them taverns. And it was a neighborhood that the immigrants in my family had settled in. And so that basically was home for me.
John, tell us a little bit about the neighborhoods that you grew up in.
I grew up in the area east of Humboldt Park, and we lived all over that section. We lived off of Milwaukee. We lived off of California. We lived in Wicker Park. We just lived all over, especially when we first came to America. We could only afford a very small space, and some of the places we rented, we stayed in for a week or 2 weeks, and then moved on to someplace else. So we lived all over that area, that east of Humboldt Park area, and the reason why we came to Humboldt Park, to that area, is because of all of the Poles who lived in that area. When we first came to America as refugees in 1951, we lived in Buffalo, New York, outside of Buffalo, New York, and we were living on a farm there. And my father got a letter from a friend who was living in Chicago, and it said, "Come to Chicago. It's like Poland." He says there are Poles everywhere. In the stores, they speak Polish in the stores. In the movie theaters, they show Polish movies. The churches, all the priests speak Polish. And so that's how we came to the Humboldt Park area, because it was so Polish in that area. And it stayed that way for a long, long time. I'm on a Facebook group that's based on St. Fidelis Parish, a Polish American parish that I lived in, and I see the names of the 400 or 500 people on that Facebook group, and we've all got Polish names, we've all got Polish backgrounds. It really made my parents feel that they were still Polish when they moved into that area. It was the second best thing to going back to Poland. They couldn't go back to Poland, but Humboldt Park was the second best thing.
Tom.
So I grew up in Belmont Cragen, kind of Fullerton and Central, just west of there. But we didn't really think of it as our neighborhood in a way, because we always operated on the kind of map of parishes over the city, because we were not surprisingly Catholic. So my mother's side of the family actually had started out in Pilsen because they were Slovak and German, so they had landed there. And my Polish grandparents had come and bought the house in the mid-20s or so, which we had only until 5 years ago, I think. So we had it for almost 100 years. But it was right near St. James, which was a much more conservative, much more Polish neighborhood. And the further west you got, kind of blurred into Italian, Irish, German. It was a much more, it was already starting to be a little bit in transition. And so, I mean, as we talk further, I think out of the four of us, I'm probably the least, I'm the exile of the bunch. I was the one who, my father did not have a great interest in assimilating, frankly, even above other members of my family, my aunts and uncles, who I think retained more of their Polish culture and heritage than we did. So we moved to another parish eventually, St. John Bosco. We kind of kept moving west in a way. And my father almost, ran from his Polish heritage, which is, we can talk about, but it kind of colors the way I think of the neighborhood, because we didn't participate. He went to Polish school, forbid me and my sister from ever going to Polish school. So even though I learned even recently that he had only spoken Polish until he was something like 10 or 12, so there was a lot going on there.
Thank you, Thomas. Dominic, would you mind sharing us a little bit about your neck of the woods?
Well, I think sometimes you choose your topic, sometimes your topic chooses you. And the Back of the Yards chose me a long time ago. So I grew up right by the stockyards, and I've actually worked in the stockyards for a couple of years as a livestock handler and a security guard. I worked my way through college there. But it was, for me, it was the part of the Back of the Yards that I lived in. It was a very diverse neighborhood as far as ethnicity goes, as far as East European, Central European ethnicity goes. So I learned how to swear in about 5 different languages right from the beginning, But I think the most Polish place in the neighborhood was my grandmother's kitchen. I mean, that was really where I spent a lot of my time. I'm third generation. My parents were born here, but they spoke Polish and they wanted me to learn Polish, and I did. And you know, we went to a Polish grammar school, Polish Catholic grammar school, where we didn't have a lot of language instruction, but about once a month or twice a month, we would have some language instruction. But growing up in that neighborhood, I became very aware of my ethnicity because everybody, you know, and everybody was different. I mean, there were 14 churches in that neighborhood. 3 of them were Polish. The rest were all different kinds of ethnicities. German, Lithuanian, Slovak, Czech, don't get them mixed up. They don't like each other, and so forth and so on, you know. And there were synagogues. So it was a very multi-ethnic place, which made it very interesting in many ways. So, you know, and of course there was always the one uniting factor was the smell from the stockyards, which sort of hung over our house all the time. I went out to the country day. I was an altar boy, and they took me out to the seminary to, you know, try to convince me to be a priest when in the 8th grade or something like that. And it was way out in the country someplace. And I said, what's that terrible smell? It turned out to be fresh air. I was getting sick because it made no sense. Now I know Stuart had the smell from the stockyards also, over in Pilsen Little Village, or what used to be called Czech, California. But I think our experiences were often a lot alike because we both witnessed ethnic change. The Hispanic, especially the Mexican population in both communities, grew very rapidly, you know, and I had a lot of multi-ethnic friends. But in my grammar school, 99.9% of the people were Polish, and everybody knew how to really pronounce my name, which is not Pacyga, but Pacyga, and even the Mexican kids knew me as Pacyga because that's what everybody called me. So it was in some ways an insular place, but in another way sort of, you know, expansive because you met all kinds of different people.
Stuart, one of the things that you've mentioned before in some of your own, in some of your previous presentations was the tension in your own life between your life as an ethnic writer and then some of the pressures that were in the neighborhood or in the, you could say, fringes of your life towards assimilation. Did you want to comment on any of that?
You know, I never really labeling myself, but never really occurred to me until much later. I didn't have an agenda. I didn't have a plan or anything of the like. What I had was a kind of an emotional attachment to stuff that later on would become material. Studs Terkel was a good friend, and he used to just get furious when I would refer to things that happen in real life as material. And I don't mean to be offensive in that way, but one of the things that a writer does is a writer translates into art things that are memory and history and so on and so forth. But a lot of accident figures in that. So I guess one of the things I'm doing is keeping kind of at arm's length the notion that I really sat down with an agenda for this stuff. It was more that if I wanted to be funny on the page, which I think is one of the hardest things to do and a great gift if you can manage it once in a while, the humor so frequently began in the family. And ethnic humor, I think, is expresses itself in every writer or filmmaker with an ethnic background. You know, one thinks about Fellini. It has very little to do with what we're talking about, Polish culture, and yet it has everything to do with it. The depiction of the family in Italy. And so the gift I was given was that tremendous sense of life that I was very aware of was not Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah.
was coming out of the immigrant family.
John, you say that your own writing is about giving voice to the neighborhood that you grew up in. How do you see what Stuart was talking about? How do you feel about that?
Well, it's interesting because I had no desire to write about my neighborhood. I had no desire to write about my parents. I didn't want to have anything to do with the kinds of lives my parents had. They had both been in concentration camps, slave labor camps in Germany, and listening to their stories always made me want to turn away. And so the last thing I wanted to do was to write about them. I wanted to be a science fiction writer. Growing up in my teens, a lot of the people I knew were either science fiction writers, or there were guys who wanted to be comic book illustrators. And some of my friends, one of my friends went off to, he wrote the second Star Wars book. Another one worked for Marvel Comics, and that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to have anything to do with my Polish background. And it wasn't until I was in my early 30s, and I was in graduate school. I was studying for a PhD in American literature. And I was just sitting there one day and I wrote a poem about my parents and about what it was they were probably thinking about that day. And then I wrote another poem and another poem and another poem. And I just kept writing about my parents over the years. And writing about my parents led me also to write about my old neighborhood. And so I'm writing these mystery novels, these Hank and Marvin mystery novels now that are set in Humboldt Park, in the Humboldt Park area. But my parents appear in the novels, and my Polish friends appear in the novels. My Polish American friends appear in the novels, and so I like to say, and it's something Stuart I think was alluding to. A lot of times, we don't pick the things that we write about. The things that we write about pick us, and we become the people that writing wants. We become the writers that writing wants us to become, and that's the way I feel about that, and how I've been led to write about my parents and the Polish neighborhood I grew up in.
It's very moving. So Thomas, I guess my question would be, why did you choose to write about history of all the things? So in my estimation, one of the things that I believe, no matter how ethnic or attached to Polishness, right, that spectrum that exists, that one of the values that Poles really, really have, and this is very typical for Eastern and Central Europe, is that attachment for history. I like to always give an example. In Poland, right, you have both vodka and cigarettes that are named after Sobieski, the Polish king that defeated the Ottoman Turks in Vienna. You have Chopin vodka. And if you have to talk about historical figures, you can find brands galore. And yet I've never had Washington cigars or Lincoln cigarettes or FDR whiskey. And so I've always seen it that no matter how that ethnic experience manifested itself, so there are some things that just inevitably come out of that lived experience. And so why did you decide to write about history?
Well, I think it came from an absence of history. I think it came from not knowing a history of Poland and not knowing a history of where I came from, because my family was so generally kind of turned away from that. I mean, I remember my mother on July 4th one day waking me up by putting on the little record player, Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, at like 12, just boom, and we were Americans, and so it always struck me, as odd when I would do the math and I'd be doing, George Washington, the Civil War, and thinking, well, nobody in my family's here. Well, okay, nobody's my family's here. It's World War I, we arrive, and that's when we become Americans. But I'm learning history about a country of which none of my people are in, and I'm sort of just accepting as a theory as being my history. And that complication of which we have to say is identity, what we kind of choose to claim as history versus what one might say is our history. And honestly, it's only been in the last few years since my mom has passed and my dad has passed and everyone else kind of in that generation. And the photos and the papers have come to me and I've sort of dug around in it more. And I'm sorry that I was never given that history. I'm sorry that my father never really passed it on in that way. And I am much more interested now in kind of reconnecting to the Austro-Hungarian roots of my family, which is basically what they were all from. It was reading Dominic's book, American Warsaw, that I began to understand the kind of class differences within Polish society and culture, which I think my father felt quite seriously. He went to college, was the first one in the family to go to college, and my aunts and uncles followed. But, he took that very, very seriously. But I think, my grandfather had been a laborer and a pipe fitter, a Chicago faucet, that's what he did. So there was enormous pride in what came out of that. And my father just kept going, and we left that history behind. I do remember one bit of history that wasn't even history post my family, was finding in a cupboard downstairs some pamphlets from World War II of the concentration camps that were done by, people who had gotten, escaped or survived. And I must have been 5 or 6. And I have to say, it was way too early for me to see things like that. And that was one of the only things written in Polish that I remember in the house. And it was an odd marker to lay for me. So I was never quite sure where we were in that story, which was horrifying. So it was complex, but I think that absence did make me much more interested in getting down to the roots of history and in really trying to get some clarity on it and just find out where things began. And so all these books that I've done, the 2 big ones I've done are in their own odd way autobiographical, as I think a lot of history quietly is for most people.
Wow. Dominic, would you care to comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking, when I was in undergrad school and graduate school, there were no Poles in the books. There were nobody with my name or any of the other names up here. There was maybe a brief mention of Kościuszko, or Pulaski, but there was no word, So I wanted to know, why was I growing up on 47th and Ashland and not in Glencoe? Why was I there? What brought me there? And so, to an extent, my historical work has been autobiographical to an extent too. Because that was an important part of it. The other part of it is, that strange Chicago way, I was always Polish, right? People would say, Polak or Polish or you're all this kind of stuff back and forth. And I was in Toronto with a group of historians and sociologists from Poland, and we were doing what historians often do. We were passing a bottle of vodka around and talking, and Grzegorz Babinski from the Jagiellonian in Krakow looked at me and said, "Dominic, you're not Polish." And it was like the first time in my life that somebody told me I wasn't Polish. It was like a slap in the face. I said, "What do you mean I'm not Polish? Come on," And we were singing Polish cavalry songs. My God, at that point. And I said, "What do you mean I'm not Polish?" He says, "Well, you're not Polish. You're an American. What's wrong with you? Why don't you understand this?" Later, when I went to teach at the Jagiellonian in Krakow, Babinski embraced me and said, "Welcome home." And I've been to Poland about 15 or 16 times since then. But history was always there in the back of my mind. Why wasn't I in the history books? My people weren't in the history books. Why weren't unskilled workers or even skilled, semi-skilled workers in the history books? And that made me want to write about them even more. And so I don't only write about Poles, but a lot of this stuff is you're right. I think in many ways, even as a historian, you're supposed to be distant from your subject. Maybe if I was writing about the French Revolution, I could be distant about my subject, but I'm writing about the people I grew up with. Doing the research on my Polish Immigrants in Industrial Chicago book, I was reading Polish newspapers where the little old lady down the block had hit the cop in the head with a brick during a strike riot. And she, to me, was always grandma. She was always babka, you know, she was the lady down the street. And yet, when she was younger, she took a brick out of the street, a paving brick, and hit the cop in the head with it and got arrested. And there it was in a newspaper, you know, during the strike of 1921-22. So then I began to realize that we have to give voice to this, some sort of sense of agency, and that's our job. And I think that, you know, all of our jobs, in a way, we're giving ourselves and others who we knew a sense of agency, a sense of being part of the discussion. And I've always felt that that was important. And I think it continues to be important.
It certainly is. I think I'd be remiss here if I didn't ask our other panelists if they've traveled to Poland. And so I guess I'd start with you, Stuart. Have you been to Poland? And if so, what are your impressions of Poland?
Well, I've got a little Czech in my family, actually. And I've spent a lot more time in Prague, but it's a fairly easy train ride to Krakow, so I've taken advantage of it, of course. I guess my impressions were that so many things that seemed mysterious to me as a child became so clear where they'd come from. Where did the food that we ate, where did it come from? Why did we eat the diet we ate? Why did my father dress the way he dressed? Where did the religion that I grew up practicing, the particular slant that it had, where was that coming from? I mean, it was, I love the anecdote that Dominic just told about you're not Polish. I mean, going to Poland actually kind of enforced that. I'm an American Pole. And yet so it was tremendously educational. And that's not even the right term. One of the things that you grapple with growing up in an ethnic family is that your sense of everything is cloaked in mystery. And going to Europe kind of affects that. It affects it very strongly.
Wow, very moving. John, have you been to Poland?
Yeah, I've been to Poland twice. I was there in 1990 and then in 2002. It was interesting going the two times, because the first time I went, we rented a car. My wife and we rented a car in Germany and drove a car through Czechoslovakia into Poland to Krakow, and we just spent like 3 weeks driving around Poland and Czechoslovakia. And for me, the interesting thing was that at that time, I felt I was Polish. My language skills, my Polish language skills were pretty good, and both my parents were still alive, and I spent a lot of time. My father never spoke English, and so I spent a lot of time speaking Polish, and I felt that I had a connection with the people I was encountering. I could speak to them. When I went back in 2002. I was on a book tour, and they asked me if I needed a translator, because I was going to be doing a lot of book events, speaking on the radio, speaking at schools. And I said, no, I don't need a translator. My Polish is excellent. And they looked at me and they said, "You know the sounds, but you don't know the words or the grammar." And then I thought about it. I said, "Well, yeah, that's probably true." And so they got me a translator, but it was an interesting experience, because even I remember I went to a coffee shop in Warsaw, and I ordered a cup of coffee, and I thought I was ordering it. I thought I was making myself clear in Polish, and the waitress looked at me and she said, "I think this guy is crazy, because he's talking crazy." And I thought to myself, she has no sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking Polish. So it was interesting going those 2 times. I'd like to go back again. And I don't think my Polish is any better than it was. I'm sure it's much worse, but it'd be interesting to go back.
Thank you for sharing. Thomas, have you been to Poland?
I have not been to Poland yet. The closest I've gotten is my son going during college. And when he announced that he was had roots in Chicago and New York, he had many, many beers bought for him. But at this point, I have not been yet. Hopefully, post-COVID, I have a very long list of places I would like to go, and it is very high on that list.
Who knows, maybe you'll be able to get a Polish edition of New York, New York, right?
Yeah, please get to work on that. I would be fine with that. Yeah, that would be good.
Dominic, since our colleagues here already shared the fact that they've been to Poland, as have you, do you have any funny stories about traveling to Poland that you want to share with everyone else?
Well, yeah, I do actually. When I first went the first time, 1986, the martial law had just been done away with, right?
Good start for a funny story, Dominic.
Well, it gets funnier. I landed in Warsaw Airport, which looked sort of like a military airport at the time. It was rather drab. There were MiGs piled along the side, and I got out into this Quonset hut, which was basically the reception area, and this young Polish soldier was there with what I think was a K-Pro computer. I don't know if you remember K-Pros, but they were the first kind of portable computers. I had one, and so did he. And he was typing it in, and he said, "Where are you from?" And my name, and I was talking to him in Polish. My Polish is not good, but I can get by. And he said, "Oh, what do you?" I said, "Oh, I'm giving a lecture today at the university in Krakow at the Jagiellonian." And he said, "Oh, that's so interesting, Professor. What are you going to talk about?" And I said, "The American working class." He says, "Well, we're a communist country. Things like that go well here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing about your lecture." And I went down. Meanwhile, this woman who is just pushing people through the line, at customs, when I get there, she says, "Open your bags." She starts taking everything out and throwing it all over the place. She says, "There's a map from PKO, right? The Polish map, and I have markings on it." He says, "Why do you have markings in Krakow?" I surrounded the castle, and I wanted to see the main square and things like that. And she says, and then she said, "Why do you have all these books? We have books in Poland. We don't need books." I said, "Well, I'm giving them to the university." And she just gave me a really hard time. And then she finally said to me, and then 2 guys come out with AK-47s and stand behind her. And she says, "So," and then I get nervous in my Polish, which is not that I really speak po Chicagoski. I speak in the Chicago manner, which nobody can understand often. And then I started really losing that. And she said, "Interesting. A minute ago you spoke Polish. Now maybe you don't. Maybe you just speak CIA." And these 2 guys click their heels and hold the gun up, and I thought, "Oh my God." So then finally this guy comes out, her boss, and looks at this. He says, "This is only history. It's not important. Tell him to go." Then she starts screaming at me to pack my bags and go through. These 2 guys with the AK-47s escort me through the gate. And they start laughing when they get out of sight from her. And they say, "Welcome to People's Poland." He said, "Forget about it. Everything's going to be fine. Go get a cup of coffee. Go do what you have to do." And it was when I went back out, I made sure I wasn't in her line. And I spoke no Polish. I just put on the worst Texas accent I could possibly find to try to get through. And they just breezed me right through the customs. So now when I go to Poland, it's like landing in New York or Paris or London. It's just you walk right in, you go through, no problem. They're just happy you're there, and bring your money. So it's not a problem at all anymore. But that first time I was really shook up because I knew they weren't going to arrest me, but they turned you around. They would take your money and then they would say, you wait for the next plane back. Well, that was 24 hours. I was going to be sitting on a bench in this Quonset hut for 24 hours, and not doing what I wanted to do. But after that, it was a fantastic trip.
Thank you for that, Dominic. And so on a historical note, one of the surprise questions that I have, and I'll start with you, Stuart. One of the most important events that actually unites both the Polish community in Chicago as well as the Polish community in Poland was the election of Pope John Paul II as Pope. And so wanted to ask if you remember when Pope John Paul II, when he was elected, if there was any talk from any of your relatives, or if you remember where you were, and also if you were here in Chicago when he came to visit in 1979.
I don't remember where I was in 1979. And I don't have any association, but I certainly have very clear memories about him when we had the Polish Pope. My family, my mother, I have a cousin who's a Franciscan. It was a highly religious family, and there was tremendous pride in John Paul's. I think it was something kind of unbelievable that wouldn't have not been believable to them. But I as I was listening to Dominic talk about his trip to Poland, I suddenly realized that this seems like I'm making a departure, and in a slight way I am. But one of the things that did happen to me when I went to Poland was I had the so-called Madeleine Albright experience. And the reason I bring it up now is that your question about the Polish Pope calls for a kind of a comment about just how important religion was to the ethnic experience. And so when I went to Poland and in front of the Holocaust temple there in Krakow, found out that the head rabbi was named Dominic Dybek, and found out that my father, who came from Yelezhna, that it was a Jewish shuttle. It was actually. It's funny that when you asked me that question, that entire thing. On the other hand, I was talking about mystery, and it was yet one more mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially we Polish people, one of the things I always thought really distinguishes us is that we're very conscious of the fact that we are, to maybe not put it diplomatically, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, we're mutts. Poles are cognizant, oh yes, I'm a Slavic, Lithuanian, German, Jewish mixture, right? Just the same way as that Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which Dominic writes about in his works, really was. It was a multinational state, as the Constitution, which came out on this date, right? The people that championed it were people that were from a vast array of different ethnic experiences, and so I think that that's reflective of that. John, if
I wasn't living. I was in graduate school when the Polish Pope became the Polish Pope, but it was a part of something else that was going on at the time. There was this Pole becomes Pope. Miłosz becomes a poet who's recognized all over the world. I was reading poetry also by Zbigniew Herbert, and Polish culture seemed to become more and more and more important in the world around me. So that I think it was one of what was happening was that I was I was in a situation where all of these Poles are suddenly becoming famous, and it made me more aware of my being Polish. And I think it was one of the things that moved me toward writing about my parents and examining my Polish background. There was just so much greatness in the Polish culture that I was becoming aware of, and I really think that it was one of the things that moved me in the direction I was moving in, toward writing about my parents and their experience.
Excellent. Thomas?
Well, I actually was at the Mass in Grant Park, quite up near the front because I was covering it for my high school newspaper. But we were very liberal Catholics. We were also very religious. My aunt was a nun, and we were very, but we were very liberal. And so we greeted John Paul, not in an ethnic way, but in a religious way. There was a certain amount of disappointment about that. But around that time, actually, I did have a kind of his relationship with solidarity and the role of solidarity was probably a much bigger kind of thrum of identity for me. I remember being in college and that December when the Soviet kind of things were coming to a head or getting very dangerous there. And, I had just signed my civil service or my draft card, which was still a thing then. I remember thinking, God, should I do this? Because it wasn't that far away from the 60s. And, thinking, well, am I going to have to go, to war and be drafted to go defend Poland? And I was like, yeah, it's my homeland. I'm from there, So I think that even more than John Paul was the solidarity, the role that Poland was playing in the world at that point probably mattered more than John Paul did.
Wow, that was great. Dominic, if you'd like to take us home, so to speak, with the question.
Well, I was way in the back at the Mass that day. You got a front seat. I was way in the back, but it was quite moving. When I first got the news that the Catholic Church had elected a Polish Pope, I called my mother. I said, Mom, we got a Polish Pope. And she said, well, you sure he's not a communist? So it was like, oh my God, relax. But it was quite an experience. And I agree with everything everybody has said. I mean, it raised the level of interest in Polish culture and Polish nationality up a few levels. And, at the same time, you like you said, you had Milosz, right? But you also had Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? He was talking, international politics. Poles seemed to be everywhere all of a sudden, and it was a sense of pride that came out of that. But and by the way, he was not a communist. John Paul II was not a communist, but despite what my mother feared there for a few minutes. But it was a remarkable time, and that Mass was actually quite remarkable as I stood in the back and as I remember it. But after that, there was a real sense, I think, and especially when things started to move in Eastern Europe as quickly as it did, there was a feeling of gratitude and of an understanding that things were really changing, so that excuse me. So that the wheel of history was turning in a way.
Thank you very much. So Jennifer, I know that there were some questions, I believe, that you were from the audience that you were going to ask our panelists.
We have some great questions from the audience. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can. The first one is, how important is knowledge or fluency in the Polish language to Polish identity, do you think?
Can you want me to take a crack at that first? Like I said, I speak po Chicagoski. I speak Polish in the Chicago manner, which is sort of like Spanglish, right? You take an American word, an English word, you add a Polish ending to it, and you suddenly think you're fluent. I think it's important to only to an extent. I think people can have a sense of Polskość or Polishness without the language. Certainly, I think it's one of the things that Poles get upset about with American Poles, that they don't speak Polish fluently, or they don't, understand the language at all. And that has come up several times, that they see this as a lack of intensity in the culture. But I don't think so. I think, there are, my daughters are half Italian, half Polish, and one of them went to language school at the Jagiellonian for a couple of summers. She speaks a little Polish, she can get by on certain things, but it's not central to her being. And yet they both understand and respect and know Polish history and Polish culture, maybe because I walk around the house talking to myself, but I don't, so I think it is important, but it's not important for an American Pole.
Can I say something about that question? My father left Poland in 1940 to be taken to Buchenwald concentration camp. My mother left in 1942. They never went back to Poland until 1989. And one of the things, and we spent like 6 months there visiting family. And one of the things that they felt about their visit was that the Polish language had changed so much that they no longer understood it the way they understood it when they were children before the war. My father said somebody came up to him, and my father was speaking to them in Polish, and the person seemed confused by what my father was saying. But despite that, if I told my father that he wasn't truly Polish because the language had evolved away from him, he would have just been outraged that I would have said that he wasn't Polish. The same thing with my mother. The two of them, they always felt that they were fundamentally, completely Polish, despite whatever had happened to the language.
That's great.
Just a slightly different take, which is that one of the reasons we're all here on this panel is that we write. And one of the things that happens when you're up in an ethnic neighborhood is that if you just write about that neighborhood, you're writing about the great American themes. And one of them is assimilation. And when you're a Polish American writer and you're writing about assimilation, you're not just writing about how Polish you are, you're writing about how Polish you aren't. You're writing about what you don't have, what you gave up. And so the thing about language is not do I have it or don't I have it. It's from the Polish American point of view. It's about the whole process of assimilation, which Thomas talked about real early in the what we're doing here. So that the context of it as writing has to do thematically with part of what you're writing about.
That really leads us into the next question perfectly. So thanks for that, setting me up there, Stuart. Somebody asked, do you think Chicago is more, less, or just as Polish in 2021 as it was in the time that you grew up?
I'll start with that one. I mean, it was having family who bought a house in the 20s there. By the time I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, people had aged out, they'd gone to the suburbs, the kind of many families were already moving on. And then during the 70s and the kind of coming of solidarity, there was a whole new wave of Polish immigrants to the neighborhood. And suddenly places that were kind of, normal, Anglo, for lack of a better word, I'm hardly Anglo, but, English speaking suddenly became Polish bars, and there was a kind of interesting repolonization of the neighborhood to a certain degree, but it wasn't entirely comfortable. There was a sense of people coming over who were much more Polish than the Poles in the neighborhood that they were moving to, thinking that they were moving to a Polish neighborhood. And so when I walked into those Polish bars, I was not necessarily greeted happily as, you know, a comrade. It was a little bit of a line there. So, you know, there's a kind of layering of immigration on top of each other that don't always have the same experience.
Very true. Somebody else has pointed out that we all happen to have on this panel 4 wonderful men who are writers, but they asked, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for women who are Chicago Polish or Polish American writers, or outside of Chicago as well?
Olga Tokarczuk.
So I'd like to just take a point here, because what my hope is that this panel will be such a success that Chicagoski will have a sequel of Chicagoska, and I already have 3 to 4 female writers in mind. And so, Jennifer, consider that as a segue to the announcement for the next program, hopefully during Polish American Heritage Month, of Chicagoska.
That's great, Dan. You've just pitched me your next event, which we will accept for sure. But I was just wondering, does anyone have any other favorite writers you wanted to share with the audience for people who might be interested in checking out some other books?
Olga Tokarczuk, Nobel Prize winner. Love her work, and her master work is coming out this year, a sort of 900-page whopper that is, I love every word she writes. I think she's just brilliant. And I literally went into bookstores this Christmas season and hand-sold that book just for fun. I kid you not, I did that.
She is brilliant. We were trying to bring her, Chopin Theater was going to cooperate, and I was hoping Northwestern would throw in too. And then the pandemic came.
Oh, yeah.
So there's hope that on the other side of it, we can bring her to Chicago.
Great.
And
Be the Chicago
I'll throw in
booster.
Szymborska.
To be the Chicago booster, there's plenty of local talent of Polish American writers that are from Chicago that are female. I'd like to start with someone that I know the Chicago Public Library has honored. And although there's plenty of others, so please, anyone who's listening, do not feel offended. Mary Wisniewski, who wrote an excellent book on Algren and also has explored some of the themes that we talk about today.
Many available in the shelves of your Chicago Public Library. So because you're all writers, we have, I think, maybe one final question, which is, what advice would you give to aspiring writers, particularly when it comes to writing about your own cultural community or your own experiences? Dominic, you want to start us on that one?
See, there's no advice at all. We don't talk to other writers. Yeah, I'd say what I've said to a lot of people who want to write, don't give up. When you get a rejection slip, that's fine. Put it in a file someplace and walk away and keep writing. You're going to get a lot of rejection slips. And not only if you're writing about Polish Americans, you're going to get a lot of rejection slips if you're writing about anything, right? Rejection is the one thing that makes a good writer. I was a terrible writer in graduate school, and I learned how to write by writing. And I think that that's the most important thing. You just, you know, Philip Roth said, just sit down and write. And he was right about that. He, you know, you just sit down and you write, and there's another favorite quote of mine from Mark Twain. He said, make your vacation your vocation. And that's really important to me too, because I tell people I can't breathe if I don't write. And I don't write as these other gentlemen do. You know, I write history. And though, you know, all of us have a secret novel in the back. So I may be sending it to you all soon. So my secret novel has been there for 30 years. It's coming. You'll just have to wait in anticipation. But I think, yeah, you just have to really work and just keep doing it and not give up. I mean, if you got the fire in the belly, keep doing it.
How about you, John? What would your advice to writers be?
Well, you know, I teach a lot of workshops on memoir writing, and what I tell people is that they should write about their families, write about their neighborhoods, write about the kids they grew up with, write about the teachers they had in school. You know, write down their own stories, because, you know, I hear from so many people in these workshops that they don't know anything about their parents or their grandparents or where anybody came from in their family. And I think that, I try to convince people that they have a responsibility to just write their own family stories. And if you get 1 million rejection letters, the story will still be there, and you'll be able to pass the story on to somebody in your family. And for me, that's really important, just writing about family, writing about neighborhood. One of the things that keeps me writing is that it's a way of revisiting my own past, and chatting with my parents who are no longer with me, talking to my friends, walking through the old neighborhoods and describing them. It's why I love writing.
How about you, Stuart? What advice would you give?
Well, I'd start off by saying it's not one size fits all. So my advice might not be a fit for anybody else, but I've taught a long time. And one of the things that I have noticed is that reading is a great art. It's a truly great art. It sets you free. It's your great friend for your entire life. So I'm not attacking reading, just it couldn't be more important for a writer. But there's a huge difference between lit and turp and making something. So a lot of the generations that we're dealing with now mostly go through university teaching. And when you sit in a lit and turp class, it's all about symbolism and what's the theme and what's the political correctness of the moment and so on and so forth. And as a young writer, it can give you this notion that it's all about ideas and that you should have these great ideas. And that's the great art of reading. The great art of writing is making an image. The great art of writing is, can you write dialogue? The great art of writing is, can you bring language to life on the page? And those are two really different things. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm aiming at here is craft. That learn the craft, which is the most deceptive craft of all the arts.
That's great. And how about you, Tom? We'll let you have the last word on this.
Stuart stole my answer. So I was going to say reading, but he kind of topped me with that. So, I mean, I would, having been someone who did not go to writing school, who kind of didn't go to any writers' workshops or anything. I mean, for me, reading really was primary. You know, those were my best real writing teachers, was by going direct to the source, because when you read a great writer, they're showing you how to do it, and they are showing you the craft. It's a little harder to unwind, but if you put in the effort to pay attention to what you're reading and how it's made, you can get far with that. So, I mean, I don't want to say I was self-taught, but I think a lot of great writers don't need to get badges or cookies. You just have to do it in the way that Dominic said, in that red shoes way. I must, I must breathe, so I write because I want to breathe. That is what it is. You have to do it. And so you don't need to be taught. You need to learn how to do it well. But you find your own teachers, I think.
That's great.
Yeah,
well,
that is. I just want to make one little note, because one of our sponsors is the Alliance of Polish Clubs tonight. And the only reason I'm bringing them by name, and we have a number of them, and we're thankful to each one of the organizations, is that the Alliance of Polish Clubs is, you could say, a umbrella organization for folks that come from all little places of Poland. And one of the one of the things is that there is in Chicago, I believe it's had almost a century, and I'm sure that the president could correct me on this, of Pilsen in Poland. Yes, there is a Pilsen in Poland. And so I know that most likely it's not the Pilsen that your neighborhood was named after, right?
Oh, it is.
but at least to them, right, when they hear Pilsen, like, Pilsen, Czech Republic, no. Pilsen, Poland. Our organization's been around for over 100 years, bringing Polish immigrants from this area. So had to bring that up.
That's great. Well, thank you, Dan. You've led me to what I'm going to say next, that we want to just say thanks again to all of our co-sponsors, CPL's Polish Heritage Committee, the Consulate General of the Republic of Poland in Chicago, Alliance of Polish Clubs, the organizers of the annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, which we hope will be back next year, the Polish Arts Club of Chicago, and Polish American Congress Illinois Division. We just want to say thank you again for their co-sponsorship and for their support. I should mention that if you're interested in reading in Polish, there are many Polish language books available at your Chicago Public Library, as well as the books from all four of the gentlemen tonight. So please do visit your local branch and check those out as well. Visit our website for additional information about upcoming virtual events. And I just want to say one more thing, that this has been really fun because this is the 20th anniversary year of One Book, One Chicago, which is our citywide reading program for adults. And we have tonight both Stuart and Tom, who were past One Book, One Chicago authors. So we just want to say thanks to them as we celebrate our 20th anniversary of the One Book, One Chicago program. More to come on that throughout the year. And thanks again to Daniel for moderating. Thanks to Stuart, Thomas, John, and Dominic for being here with us tonight. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.